Jimmy Carter was born on October 1st, 1924 in Plains, Georgia. He was the son of a peanut farmer. Growing up, Jimmy's friends were mostly the black kids that worked on the farm, and once in high school he began to notice, and he's kind of confused by, he got deferential treatment from the black friends of his. They would let him go through a gate first, and he didn't understand what was up with that. He didn't really understand the difference in racial color. It wasn't a thing to him. He was a straight-A student. He played basketball, and he had dreams of joining the Navy and becoming a candidate to join the Naval Academy at Annapolis. His parents are Earl and Lillian. Now, Earl is a segregationist, and he had about 200 people, mostly black, working for him on his farm. Lillian was kind. She would help anyone in need and had a reputation as such. Now, it turns out Jimmy does indeed attend Annapolis, and Rosalind Smith, the best friend of Jimmy's sister Ruth, one day saw a picture of Jimmy at their house and asked who it was. When she was told that it was Ruth's brother Jimmy, she said, "Oh, well, me likey," or something to that effect. I don't know what she said. But when Jimmy was home on a break, they were introduced, and he absolutely swept her off her feet. They were married 1 month after his graduation from Annapolis. Now, she would take care of the kids when he was off at sea or in the Navy, and Jimmy Carter, in the Navy, was thrilled to be assigned to submarine duty. Now, after 6 years, he became the senior officer on the Seawolf. Now, the Seawolf was the vanguard of the nuclear submarine program. And this was a source of great pride for him. One time when they surfaced and went into port in Bermuda, a British official extended party invites to all the white crew members. Well, Jimmy Carter got everyone to refuse to attend, thus demonstrating his compassionate influence and his principles for equality. Essentially, his knowledge qualifies him as a nuclear scientist. So when we write Jimmy Carter off historically, as some tend to do, as a peanut farmer who became president, we neglect to mention that he spent more time in a military uniform than any other president in the 20th century except for Eisenhower. He was in the Navy for 10 years aboard the vanguard of the nuclear submarine program, the Seawolf. Now, once in the Navy, for that 10 years, his dad got cancer, and in 1953 he died. Jimmy Carter was amazed at how many black and white people came to pay homage to his father. And it was a testament to the fact that even though he was a segregationist, his father treated people with respect. Left the Navy to go back to run the farm. This infuriated his wife, Rosalind. She had thought that Jimmy was her ticket out of a small-town lifetime in Georgia, and in fact, here they are returning to run the farm, and the whole 3-day drive back to Georgia, she didn't even speak to him. When Jimmy returns to Georgia, it is during the era of desegregation. The Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling had recently been handed down. Jimmy Carter was courted by the White Citizens Council and asked to join. He refused to join. It was a segregationist group. And he ran for the Georgia Senate and lost, but he contested the election, claiming that there was voter fraud. He was threatened. He stuck by it, and he actually won his case in court. He was able to prove there had been voter fraud. Now, he ran for governor in the 1966 primary against a notorious racist bigot, Lester Maddox. He came in a strong third, and having lost to him, he is devastated and $60,000 in debt. This is when Jimmy Carter began to question his faith, and he became a born-again Christian and went door to door preaching the word. And in fact, to this day, on any given Sunday, you'll find Jimmy Carter teaching Sunday school class, as he has most of his adult life. So he ran again in 1970, and he courted the segregationist vote. However, in his inaugural address after he won, he condemned racial inequality. He appointed blacks to his team. He reformed criminal justice and mental health programs. In 1972, he was hoping to become George McGovern's vice presidential candidate on a ticket that would run against Richard Nixon, who was running for re-election. He was not the candidate, and probably best that he wasn't. George McGovern ended up losing in a landslide to Richard Nixon. In 1974, he announced his intention to run for president, preaching fairness and being a Washington outsider, and that he was not a lawyer, he was a Southerner, and he was religious. However, he's only a one-term governor that no one had ever heard of nationally. Americans, however, were fed up with Watergate and the lies of LBJ and Nixon, who had lied to the American public about how we were doing in Vietnam, saying that we will win this, knowing full well at the time that they wouldn't. And he comes along and says, "I will never lie to you." That's a message that will resonate. He would be running against incumbent Gerald Ford, interestingly, the only president who had not been elected as either president or vice president, because he had replaced Spiro Agnew as vice president. This was when Spiro Ted Agnew had to resign in disgrace due to his corrupt practice of taking bribes for government contracts. Now, they actually charged him only with income tax evasion on the basis that he resigned from office. He is the first vice president ever having to do so, followed by the first president ever having to do so when Richard Nixon had to resign in disgrace due to the Watergate scandal. And thus, Ford, a candidate as neither vice president or president, is now the president of the United States. Well, Carter wins the Iowa caucuses, and then he descended on New Hampshire, and he knocks on literally 60,000 doors, and he won New Hampshire. Then he goes on to Florida, where he beat George Wallace, who was Alabama's pro-segregationist governor that had run in 1968 and had been shot while campaigning. Now a paraplegic in a wheelchair, Wallace professed to no longer being a segregationist. Jimmy won the nomination. Now, part of the charm was the colorful Carter family. Billy, his brother, known as a big beer drinker, who actually read one book a day. Billy had resented Jimmy Carter coming back to run the farm and being routinely dismissed as some kind of country bumpkin. He once remarked, "I got a mother who went into the Peace Corps at the age of 68. I got a sister who's a holy roller preacher. I got another sister who rides motorcycles and wears helmets. And I got a brother who thinks he's going to be the president of the United States. I'm the only sane one in the family." And in fact, it turns out that Billy actually did read about one book every day. They found 20,000 books in his attic after he died, all with notes in the margins and underlines throughout all of them. Miss Lillian, Jimmy Carter and Billy Carter's mother, had indeed joined the Peace Corps and went to India when she was 68 years old. Jimmy Carter is essentially a centrist Democrat with liberal values. During the 1976 campaign, Jimmy did a Playboy interview and said, "I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times." What he was trying to say was that he was a sinner too, like everyone else. This nearly cost him the election. However, Ford closed the 20-point gap, and Jimmy Carter still ekes out a razor-thin margin victory. He ends up taking an unplanned walk from inauguration, from the Capitol to the White House, over a mile, where he got out of the car, and people couldn't believe it. Originally a suggestion to promote exercise, Carter embraced it as a gesture of being secure with the people who elected him. It has now become a tradition that on the way from the inauguration, the candidate gets out and walks a short distance. Jimmy walked the entire mile. Now he seeks to take on the Washington insiders. And Jimmy is seen as arrogant. He's unwilling to woo Congress. He doesn't know how to work the machinery because he ran on the basis that he is not a Washington insider. And so he's somebody that is going to find himself without any alliances. He doesn't help because when he does things like not serving any hard liquor at the White House, all events are over by midnight, so there's no overtime pay. And he turns off the air conditioning in the White House to save taxpayer money. and again has no alliances. Liberal Democrats are anxious to pursue the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. And this would be spearheaded by the lion in the Senate, which is Ted Kennedy, youngest brother to Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy. Jimmy Carter wanted to cut spending and demonstrate fiscal restraint. And in so doing, by June in his first year in office, he is enjoying a 70% approval rating. Then Burt Lance, who is Jimmy Carter's budget director, winds up in a bank scandal. He's investigated for corruption as chairman of the board at Calhoun First National Bank of Georgia, and Jimmy sticks by him and ultimately gets dragged down by scandal. Now, in the era of post-Watergate, you've got a print and media that are looking for hypocrisy, and they want to show that they're tough on any president, not just Richard Nixon, which they had been accused of being out to get Nixon. Well, so they go after Burt Lance in the media. Lance resigns. Ultimately, he is cleared of all charges and vindicated, but his judgment was questioned, as is Jimmy Carter's for having stuck by him, because his approval rating drops 25%. So instead of calling the shots, he is now a wounded executive. Jimmy Carter appeals to Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel to meet and have a dialogue at Camp David to see if they can't somehow arrive at a peace deal. They agree to the summit, but tell him he has very high hopes for something that is not likely to happen. In fact, once there, they won't even speak to each other. They are in separate quarters, and Jimmy has to relay messages between going over and speaking to one, saying, what would you like? What would make you happy if you have a peace deal with them? And then he goes back and relays that. It goes back and forth. It's what they call today shuttle diplomacy. However, everything's falling apart. They're not reaching any kind of agreement. They don't get along. And they tell the president that they are leaving. And the morning that they are to leave, at breakfast, Jimmy Carter has asked one of his aides to get a list of their grandchildren's name. And he tells them, if we can't work out a peace deal for us, could we possibly do it for our grandchildren and our children? And he proceeds to name each of their grandchildren individually by name. This is such an emotional thing. Menachem Begin actually cries, and they decide to stay around and work out a peace deal. And in fact, they do. The main points of contention were about dismantling the Sinai settlements, and an agreement is reached that Israel will return the Sinai territories that they had held since the war in 1964, and Egypt would recognize Israel's right to live in peace. Begin and Sadat received the Nobel Peace Prize. Jimmy Carter doesn't even get a bump in the polls. He ends up going to Russia to discuss the SALT II treaty with the new Russian leader Brezhnev, and comes out of there perceived as weak and a sellout to the Soviets. So the treaty is signed, but not ratified by Congress. He attends an economic summit in Tokyo at a time when inflation has hit 14%. Oil prices skyrocket. There are riots over such things in places like Pennsylvania. Jimmy Carter talks about human rights, but he ends up toasting the Shah of Iran. And the Shah of Iran is considered by middle and lower class citizens of Iran to be a tyrant. He's a friend only to the extremely wealthy, and had been put in office after Eisenhower had sent CIA agents into Iran in the 1950s to help overturn the government under Mossadegh, a nationalist who simply wanted to have control of their oil fields as it was theirs to sell, and wanted to be rid of the oil companies that had come in, and he paid them to leave. And so the United States looks at that as something where it's no longer serving our Western interest, and so they end up undercutting this guy, Mossadegh, and ultimately the Shah of Iran, who is friendly to Western interests, ends up becoming the leader in Iran. Jimmy Carter cuts into social programs, and therefore he alienates Ted Kennedy liberals. So here's A guy whose reputation is floundering, his approval rating is down, and the perception is that Jimmy Carter is a good guy who's in over his head. So he retreats to Camp David to consult with America's great minds. They all gave him scathing reviews, and consequently, he addresses the country in what is now known as his crisis of confidence speech. And in it, he says to Americans that Americans used to sacrifice more and recognize that it was necessary. And we become a nation of people who feel entitled rather than willing to work for the things we have to have and sacrifice when need be. The public felt this is Jimmy Carter blaming the problems of the country on them instead of on Washington. It's a tradition to accept your cabinet members' resignations on the first of the year, and then you hire them back. It's a tradition. Jimmy Carter accepted all 5 cabinet resignations and did not hire them back. He collapsed running a marathon. So not only does he look weak politically, he looks weak literally, physically. And if you're going to run a marathon, you might want to make sure that you can actually do that. He tries to escape his troubles by going out in a rowboat, where he is attacked by a rabbit. A rabbit that jumped off of the bank and started swimming furiously towards Carter in the rowboat, trying to get into the boat. And the picture of Jimmy Carter was snapped where he's taking the oar from the rowboat and trying to beat this rabbit that was trying to get into the rowboat. Carter can't get a break. His colorful family became a liability, especially Billy and Billy Beer, the brand of beer that had been named for him. And the Soviet Union is a problem as well when they invade Afghanistan, and Carter withdraws the SALT II treaty. He also boycotts the 1980 Olympics in Russia. Now, this is going to be something that remains controversial. People will say that he is penalizing athletes who have worked all of their life for this moment to participate in something that is not supposed to be political, and yet they are being denied the opportunity. And of course, in the Olympics, it's not like you can say, well, I'll go next time, because it'll be 4 years later, and chances are you will be beyond your physical peak to compete. He let the Shah of Iran come to the United States for cancer treatment. This is when the Shah's plane was literally looking for a place to land, and country after country said, not here. Carter said, as a born-again Christian, he cannot deny that this man should be allowed to land here and get treatment. Well, this is going to be a big problem because the Iranian students will react to this, offering refuge to the Shah of Iran, and they will end up taking 53 U.S. embassy workers hostage. The hostage crisis makes Jimmy Carter look weak on a daily basis for 444 days. He is negotiating with the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is now the religious leader in charge of the country, and Jimmy Carter finally concludes that diplomacy is not going to work, so he decides to try and concoct a rescue mission to get the hostages back. Desert One is that mission, and it is a major disaster. A sandstorm whips up out of nowhere, and 2 helicopters go down, and with it, 9 lives are lost. And so now he has the rescue disaster, and the hostages are still in Iran, and the hostages at this point will now be dispersed through different places so as to foil any future attempts at rescuing them all in one place. When it's time for re-election, he's challenged by Ted Kennedy, who doesn't believe that Jimmy Carter has gone to the left enough. And he survives the Kennedy challenge, but not the party division that Kennedy had brought to the party. And Carter will never have much nice to say about Teddy Kennedy after that. He will blame him for splitting the party and costing them the election. The economy is in shambles, the Soviets are in Afghanistan, and the hostages are in Iran. Reagan is the GOP candidate. As the Republican candidate, Jimmy Carter tries to paint him as a trigger-happy and irrational man who has his finger on the button for nuclear war and dying to press it. So Reagan, during the debates, figures out all he has to do is appear rational and not crazy, and he will therefore win the debate if he just doesn't look nuts. He wins the debate, and the election. It appears that, or perhaps people speculate, that Reagan had been in touch with those who were holding the hostages and negotiated with them to keep them until he's in office, because the students who are holding the hostages after 444 days, they themselves are looking for a way out of this too. And so maybe they can settle for humiliating Jimmy Carter, costing him the election, which it did, in exchange for releasing the hostages the moment that Ronald Reagan takes office. And Reagan sees this as something that can work to his advantage during the election, and purportedly tells them not to release them until after he is elected. The hostages are released 1 minute after Reagan takes office. Now, in his post-presidency, Jimmy Carter has started the Carter Center, where he hosts world leaders and mediates international disputes. He got the Haiti dictator to step down in favor of a democratically elected Aristide. And he also started the Habitat for Humanity, where he's building homes for the poor, literally. To this day, Jimmy Carter may be found pounding nails into frames, wooden frames, as he literally builds homes for the poor. In 2002, he defied George W. Bush by going to Cuba and endorsing diplomatic relations. Also in 2002, Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize for all of the good work he had done in his post-presidency, as well as for the recognition that he should have gotten when he was in office forging a peace between Egypt and Israel. Jimmy and Rosalind today, he's 97 and she's 94, and they have been celebrating recently 75 years of marriage. The longest marriage of any president, and he is the oldest of any president to have lived to the age of 97. He's shattered all the records. He still has a remarkable wit. He is still very with it. He still teaches Sunday school, and arguably, whatever you might think of his presidency, it might be said that Jimmy Carter is perhaps one of the greatest men to have ever been president.